Tonight we're going to talk about the Scottish Rite and the dog days of the Depression, Part 1. Last month we labored hard to get a glimpse of what life was like in the United States during the 1930s, the decade known as the Great Depression. References to our fraternity were relatively few as we concentrated on bank failures, unemployment, crop failures, oil busts. Also covered were horrible weather conditions of heat, drought, and dust storms, and mass migration of people, primarily farmers, to the West Coast. Tonight I will try to place the Scottish Rite and its activities into that same time frame, that period of economic chaos. Since I know you are already aware of the hard times from our meeting last time, they will receive minimal amount of mention. In March, we covered the Scottish Rite history up to and through the 1920s. You will recall that John Coles was elected Sovereign Grand Commander in October of 1921. His reign lasted for 31 years, which matched the tenure of Albert Pike, who also served in that position of leadership for 31 years. Coles, along with Pike and James T. Richardson, are referred to as the three greatest Scottish Rite leaders of all time. Coles' physical appearance was much different than the other two, who were both large men, over 6 foot tall. Coles was a stocky 5 foot 5 inches tall. He was a lifelong bachelor. Some say his only marriage was to the Scottish Rite. Coles began his tour of duty during the golden years, 1921. Each year, membership figures rose over the previous year during the 20s, that is, until 1928. The financial picture is always good when membership is soaring. During his first few years, Coles traveled extensively as he had no family responsibilities. He went on a 2-month world tour at one time, greeting and promoting Scottish Rite wherever he went. The so-called Scottish Rite golden years began shutting down in 1928. Membership numbers, we mentioned this last month, membership numbers were down, fewer candidates, non-payment of dues, and there was a reduced attendance at lodge meetings and reunions. Now this was before the Depression hit. The Supreme Council was wrestling with these issues, and Coles began thinking that maybe he was doing something wrong, and was even thinking that maybe he should step down. Everyone had their own ideas regarding this condition, and many writers in the New Age magazine were becoming critical of normal Scottish Rite customs and procedures. Coles sensed that this was a sure pathway to defeat, and this is when he established the policy that nothing potentially negative, at least regarding the Scottish Rite, should appear in the New Age magazine. This policy continued into the 1930s, and I mentioned last month that very few items in the New Age told of the trials and tribulations of the valleys during the Depression because it was negative in nature. In the middle 20s, membership in the southern jurisdiction peaked to 258,000. Now this is the southern jurisdiction, and this is Scottish Rite we're talking about. And then hit a Depression low of 154,000, a drop of 40%. Now, since the northern jurisdiction was smaller in number of states but larger in membership during these years, this would indicate that the pre-Depression membership in the United States was well over 500,000, 500,000 people. Now that's counting both jurisdictions. Another interesting pre-Depression stat was that Masons totaled more than 50% of both houses of Congress, 59 in the Senate and 317 in the House, and 11 of them had the rank of 33rd degree. During these pre-Depression years, Masonry and the Scottish Rite were both flying high. The treasury at the Supreme Council level was in good shape. The House of the Temple was paid for, so they had no major indebtedness. Also, during the good years of the teens and the early 20s, the Supreme Council had been good stewards of the strong influx of money by bypassing big returns on equity stock purchases and placing most of the income in U.S. Treasury bonds. Therefore, when the crash occurred, the Scottish Rite was not so severely hit. When the bottom dropped out, the Scottish Rite was looking pretty good on the outside, but was struggling with membership and attendance problems. As the years rolled by, this recession did not correct itself as good recessions are supposed to do. It went the other way, and the nation realized we had plunged into what then has been called now the Great Depression. The grassroots area of Masonry, that is the Blue Lodge and the Scottish Rite valleys, were really suffering. During these golden years, many valleys had embarked upon massive building projects, large buildings with large stages and auditoriums. When the bubble bust, they were in dire financial straits with reduced membership and income and big mortgages to pay. Many had to declare bankruptcy. However, here this is one interesting and good sidelight, is that not many of the Scottish Rite buildings were lost because of unique circumstances, and here's why. There was no market for these buildings at that time. So if the bondholders repossessed them, they would then have to pay the property taxes on them themselves. And that would be a negative to them from the cash flow point of view. So most of the valleys were able to keep their temples even though they were having problems making payments. Speaking of property taxes, the House of the Temple faced the same problem. In 1930, these taxes on the House of the Temple amounted to $12,808. Grand Commander Coles called on all his friends in Congress, and eventually, not immediately, but by the middle of the Depression, he was able to get a tax-exempt status for the House of the Temple by a special act of Congress. However, to help the plight of the valleys, the Supreme Council reduced the per capita tax by more than 50%, from $1.25 to 60 cents. What is it now, John?
Per capita? I don't know what it is off the top of my head.
Anyway, it's a lot more than that right now. But anyway, it went from $1.25 to 60 cents. So with a 40% drop in membership and then a reduction in the per capita, the Supreme Council began then to feel the squeeze. Rather than lay off some employees, all salaries were reduced, and the Grand Commander and the Secretary General each accepted a 10% pay cut. Notwithstanding the Depression, life went on with the Supreme Council during the 1930s. They continued their support of public education and their push for a separate Department of Education in the President's cabinet. Now, they pushed for that for years, and it never took place until 1980. It finally became a cabinet post, the Department of Education. But anyway, they were constantly pushing for it, thinking that it would help the status of public education. In a like manner, they continued their opposition to any form of government support of parochial education. And of course, this helped continue the gap with Catholicism. As mentioned previously, the New Age magazine did not allow any self-criticism of the Scottish Rite, but they were quite strong on the criticism of the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany. In 1930, there were 10 Grand Lodges in Germany, and Hitler soon eliminated all of them. Everything they stood for, he was against. Grand Commander Coles, during the 1930s, in today's terminology, could have been called a hawk. During those days, the general sentiment in the United States was pro-Allies, but anti-war. We wanted to help Britain and France with supplies and moral support, but we wanted to let them do the fighting. We didn't want to send our troops over there again. Well, Coles was outspoken in saying, "Do not negotiate with Hitler. He cannot be trusted." Coles was telling our country to get prepared because we were going to have to fight again. And he was right. As a general statement about Grand Commander Coles' leadership during this dog days of the Depression, tough times for the nation, definitely tough times for our fraternity, he was always optimistic, always confident about the future, both of our country and the Scottish Rite. I think of him as being in the same mold of a truly great leader of that time, Winston Churchill. Matter of fact, they both looked alike, both short and stocky. But they both seemed to have the attitude, we don't care what obstacles we face, we'll take them on and we'll win. We've now taken a look at the Scottish Rite at the national level during the dog days of the Depression. The next normal sequence would be to look at the Scottish Rite on the local scene during these times. In my effort to shorten these monthly presentations, I have decided to postpone that segment until next month. This would make the whole series on the Depression into a three-part rather than a two-part series. So to close out this talk tonight, I want to bring to your attention, a radio broadcast to the world by Will Rogers. Of course, you know, one of our claims to fame here at McAlester Scottish Rite is that this famous person received his higher degrees in our temple in 1908. Of course, in 1908, he was not as famous as he got later on, but as he was only a rope-twirling, wisecracking rodeo performer and cowboy at that time. To set the stage, let me remind you now, this is 1930. Will Rogers was considered either the most recognized name or at least one of the most recognized names not only in the United States but around the world. By this time he had outgrown the rope twirling, but he was still full of the wisecracks. He was a stage performer. An example was his appearance in the Ziegfeld Follies of the Roaring Twenties. He had also graduated from into the movie business, making the transition from silent film to talkies. He was a syndicated newspaper columnist with articles appearing in over 200 of the largest newspapers in the country. And he was one of the first proponents of aviation as the next major mode of travel. In all these activities, he was constantly on the go, most of the time by air travel. And this gave him a chance to see the suffering of the people during these trying times. He made a personal appeal to President Hoover for government help for these people, particularly the farmers. And when he did not receive immediate help, he embarked on a tour of Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas himself, making 2 or 3 performances a day for 18 days. All of the money made through ticket sales and donations was handed over to that area's Red Cross or similar organizations for relief of local area farmers. A few years ago, there was an article in the McAlester Scottish Rite newsletter telling about his stop in McAlester. What is unique about his stop in McAlester is that, as far as we know, he was in our city only twice. The first time, he was a candidate in the class of 1908, when the red brick building was less than a year old. Then again in February 1931, when our current temple was less than 3 months old. So both times that he was here, he was in basically new buildings. Obviously, Will Rogers remembered his growing up days. He knew about hard times, and he was sympathetic and empathetic with those folks who were having a hard time feeding their families. So I've now laid the foundation of this aforementioned radio broadcast. In the summer of 1932, the city of Los Angeles was hosting the 10th Olympiad, or perhaps better described as the 1932 Summer Olympic Games. Fearing that the Depression, which was now worldwide, would damage attendance, Hollywood stars, including Will Rogers, were enlisted to promote the games on a worldwide radio broadcast. Of course, we didn't have TV then, so this was the best method of communication. Rogers tried to be upbeat, but the sad state of the economy put an edge on his comments. Now listen to these. This was his comments. What's the use of kidding ourselves? We are broke. And he's talking, to the people overseas. And you are broke too. The whole world is broke. We are not nearly as cocky in America as we used to be. We are a humble people now. So you better come see us before we start getting rich again. He went on to say, never was the world more on an equal. Never was the world as friendly. Poverty has made us humans again, and it has made us all sort of like kin. So come visit us during the Olympics. What a great example of down-home, folksy, tongue-in-cheek humor from Will Rogers. Rogers was not vocal about his Masonic affiliation, but he was a shining example of what we stand for in the area of charity for others. Next time we will have the Depression in the local area.